The bus rolled through the heavy iron gates of Fort Jackson, its tires crunching against the gravel road as the early morning sun stretched across the base. A dozen recruits sat stiffly in their seats, their faces pale with nerves and excitement. Among them sat Emily Carter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening as she tried to steady the storm inside her chest. She had imagined this moment for years, stepping onto the ground, where her father once trained, but the reality of it was heavier than she had ever prepared for. The bus hissed to a stop. The doors opened with a metallic groan, and the smell of damp earth and oil spilled inside. The recruits scrambled out, their boots striking the ground in uneven rhythm. Emily stepped down last, adjusting the strap of her duffel bag across her shoulder. For a brief moment, her eyes swept the base rows of barracks, a distant training field, and the towering flagpole at the center of the compound where the stars and stripes waved proudly in the morning wind. It should have been a moment of pride. Instead, it felt like the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed on her. The group barely had time to gather before a sharp voice cut through the air. "Line up! Move, move, move!" A towering figure in a starched uniform stormed forward Colonel Briggs. His boots pounded the ground with the precision of a drumbeat, his face carved from years of discipline and authority. Every recruit scrambled into line, their movements awkward and uncoordinated. Emily adjusted her stance quickly, standing shoulder to shoulder with men nearly twice her size. Briggs' eyes swept over the line like a hawk scanning prey. His presence alone was enough to silence the nervous shuffling. He stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on Emily. A pause. A frown. "You," he barked, his voice carrying like a whip. "Name, Private Emily Carter, sir." She responded, her voice louder than she expected. Briggs' eyebrow arched. "Carter, you think this is summer camp? You think you're going to march in here and earn yourself a medal just because you showed up?" Emily's throat tightened, but she forced her answer out steady. "No, sir. No, sir. What? No, sir. I came here to serve my country, sir." The colonel smirked. A humorless sound, more of a sneer than amusement. He shook his head and walked on, his boots grinding into the dirt. But the recruits felt it. The silent target had been marked. Emily Carter was not going to have it easy. Inside the barracks, the new soldiers were given their bunks, uniforms, and a whirlwind of instructions. The air was thick with disinfectant, and the faint smell of sweat from generations of recruits who had passed through before them. Emily found her bunk at the far corner, dropped her duffel bag, and exhaled deeply. She had expected stares, maybe whispers, but what she felt was heavier, a mixture of doubt and disdain. Some of the male recruits exchanged looks as she unpacked. A few smirked, others avoided her entirely. To them, she was an oddity, a distraction, or worse, someone who didn't belong. That night, as lights flicked off and the barracks sank into darkness, Emily lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling. She could hear muffled laughter and whispered conversations about her, words she pretended not to notice. "She won't last a week. Colonel's gonna eat her alive. Bet she's gone by Friday." Emily's fists curled under the blanket, but she stayed silent. She thought of her father, Sergeant William Carter, who had died during a mission overseas. He had been her hero, her compass. Before his final deployment, he had taken her to the edge of this very base, pointed at the gates, and said, "One day, Em, you'll walk through there. And when you do, don't let anyone tell you you're not strong enough." The memory steadied her. She whispered a promise into the darkness. "I'll make you proud, Dad." The first morning of training arrived like a storm. At 4:30 a.m., the blaring sound of a bugle ripped through the barracks. Recruits scrambled, half-dressed, tripping over boots and bags as instructors barked orders. Emily moved swiftly, her uniform already folded neatly by her bed. She tied her boots with quick precision, heart pounding as she joined the others outside. The chill of dawn cut through the base, fog curling across the training field. Colonel Briggs stood tall at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice boomed across the recruits. "You're not soldiers yet. You're clay. My job is to break you down and rebuild you. Some of you will make it. Some of you won't. And I'll make damn sure the weak ones get washed out before they embarrass the uniform." His gaze locked on Emily again, piercing and sharp. A knowing smirk curved his lips, as if daring her to prove him wrong. The first run began. 3 miles before breakfast, and half the recruits were already gasping. Emily kept her pace steady, her breath controlled, her legs burning, but refusing to give out. She knew this was just the beginning, the first of countless tests. And she also knew she carried something the others didn't: the weight of her father's memory, the fire of her own promise. By the end of the run, sweat poured down her face, but her stride never faltered. When the colonel called for them to line up again, she stood tall, her chest heaving, but her eyes unbroken. Briggs scanned the recruits and paused briefly on her. For a fleeting moment, there was something almost like surprise in his expression. Then it hardened again. The day stretched into drills, push-ups, and shouted commands. Emily pushed through every ache, every bruise, every glance of doubt. She knew one thing for certain: if the colonel wanted to break her, he would have to try harder. That night, as she collapsed onto her bunk, her body screamed with exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue was a spark of quiet fire that told her she had survived day one. She was still standing. Outside, the base buzzed with the hum of night. Inside, Emily Carter closed her eyes and whispered once more into the silence, "I belong here, and I'll prove it." The journey had only just begun. The second week of training had only just begun when Colonel Briggs decided to make an example out of someone. He had a reputation across Fort Jackson. He believed in breaking recruits down to their rawest state. Pain, sweat, humiliation, these were his tools. For some, it forged discipline. For others, it destroyed them. The morning air was crisp, damp with dew, and the recruits were lined up in perfect rows on the training field. The sun had barely risen, its orange glow stretching across the horizon. Yet every soldier was already dripping with sweat from push-ups and sprints. Colonel Briggs stood in front of them, arms folded behind his back, his eyes scanning the line like a predator searching for weakness. "Sloppy," he barked after a drill. "Every damn one of you looks like you're here for a summer picnic instead of training for war." The recruits froze, breaths held, shoulders tense. No one wanted to be singled out. But Briggs' gaze had already found its target. His eyes narrowed, and a slow smile crept across his face. "Carter," he snapped. "Step forward." Emily stiffened but obeyed, boots striking against the dirt as she marched to the front of the formation. She stood at attention, chin up, eyes forward. "Yes, sir." Briggs circled her like a hawk. "Private Carter, do you think you're special? Do you think because you're here, with your tidy boots and your neat hair, that you belong?" "No, sir. I don't think I'm special, sir," Emily replied firmly, her voice even. "Oh?" Briggs tilted his head. "Because to me, you stand out. And not in a good way. You're weak. You're slow. You're a distraction to every man standing here. And that makes you a liability." The recruits shifted uncomfortably. A few lowered their eyes. They had seen this tactic before the colonel, choosing someone to break publicly, someone to serve as a warning. Most times, the recruit either cracked or quit. Briggs turned sharply and walked toward a steel bucket near the edge of the field. It had been filled that morning with icy water for cooling cloths after the run. Without a word, he lifted it easily with one hand, the water sloshing against the sides. Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't move. "Stand tall, Private," Briggs said with a sneer. "Let's cool you off." Before anyone could react, the colonel upended the bucket over her head. The freezing water cascaded down her face, soaking her uniform completely, dripping into her boots. The shock of the cold nearly stole her breath. The recruits gasped collectively, and then hesitant laughter spread through the ranks. Briggs tossed the bucket aside. The clang of metal against the dirt rang out like a gavel slamming judgment. "This," he said, pointing at Emily as she stood dripping and shivering, "is what happens when you waste my time. When you think you're tougher than you are." The laughter faded into silence. The recruits weren't sure if they should join in or stay quiet. Many looked away, ashamed. A few smirked nervously, grateful it wasn't them. Emily's chest heaved, her soaked hair plastered to her face. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't flinch. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't move an inch. Her eyes, burning through the water dripping into them, stayed locked forward. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, but her voice was steady. Briggs' smile faltered for half a second. Just a second. Then he barked, "Get back in line." "Yes, sir." She marched back, boots squelching with each step. The recruits parted slightly, making room for her. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the drip of water from her uniform onto the dirt. The rest of the morning dragged on with drills, but for Emily, every movement was heavier. The cold clung to her skin, her boots rubbed blisters where water sloshed inside, and the weight of humiliation pressed against her chest like a stone. Every time she caught sight of Briggs, she felt the sting of his smirk echoing in her mind. By the time they returned to the barracks, whispers had already spread. "Did you see her face? Colonel really put her in her place. She's done. Bet she won't last the week." Emily ignored them. She stripped off her soaked uniform, changed into dry clothes, and sat silently on her bunk. Her body shivered, not just from the chill, but from the storm inside her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out, but she did none of those things. Instead, she closed her eyes and remembered her father's voice, calm and steady, like it had always been when he trained her in the backyard as a teenager. "Discipline isn't what you show when things are easy. It's what you hold on to when the world tries to break you." That night, long after lights out, Emily lay awake listening to the steady breathing of her bunkmates. The humiliation replayed in her mind, sharp and fresh. She clenched her fists under the blanket. She realized something important. Briggs hadn't drenched her because she was weak. He had done it because he wanted to see her crack, to see her run, to confirm what he already believed, that she didn't belong. And that, Emily decided, was exactly why she wouldn't quit. The next morning, Emily woke before the bugle sounded. She slipped out of bed quietly, lacing her boots in the dark. The air outside was cool, the stars still clinging to the sky. She jogged across the field alone, each breath sharp in her lungs. She pushed herself harder, running further than the day before, her legs screaming with pain. She welcomed it. She embraced it. By the time the others were dragged out of bed by the bugle, Emily was already drenched again, but this time it was in sweat, not humiliation. She slipped back into line with them as if nothing had happened. The colonel noticed. He didn't say a word, but his sharp eyes followed her for longer than usual. By midday, the recruits had started whispering less about the bucket incident and more about the girl who hadn't cracked. Emily carried herself the same as before, chin up, shoulders straight. She didn't complain. She didn't speak about what happened. She acted as if the icy water had never touched her. But inside, something had changed. The humiliation had burned away her fear, leaving behind something harder, stronger. She knew the road ahead would be brutal. But she also knew this. Colonel Briggs had tried to drown her spirit in a bucket of water, and instead, he had only lit a fire. And that fire was going to shock the entire base. The bucket incident had already become a story, whispered in the mess hall, the barracks, and even during late-night drills. Recruits retold it with nervous laughter. How Colonel Briggs had humiliated Emily Carter in front of everyone. How she had stood there dripping and silent, and how she had walked back into line without flinching. To some, she was a joke. To others, she was strangely unforgettable. But for Emily herself, it was no joke. It was fuel. Every night after lights out, she lay awake staring at the barrack ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing and occasional snores of her fellow recruits. But unlike the others, sleep rarely came. Her mind replayed the colonel's sneer, the shock of the freezing water, and the murmurs that followed her for days. "She's done. Bet she quits." The colonel broke her. She clenched her fists each time the memory surfaced. No, she would not let that moment define her. If anything, it had reminded her of her father's lessons. The world wouldn't hand her respect. She would have to earn it. The next morning, Emily was up long before the bugle. While the rest of the barracks was lost in sleep, she dressed silently, her boots laced tight, and slipped out into the darkness. The air was sharp with cold, stars still scattered across the sky. She stretched briefly, then started to run. Her legs ached almost immediately. Yesterday's drills had left her muscles screaming, but she pushed forward. Each breath tore at her lungs, but she welcomed the pain. She ran past the barracks, past the silent training field, down the dirt road that wound around the base. "Faster," she whispered to herself. Her pace quickened. Sweat slicked her back despite the chill. She pushed until her body threatened to collapse, then pushed a little further. When she finally returned, the horizon was glowing pink, and the bugle was only minutes away from sounding. She stood alone, chest heaving, hands on her knees. The recruits who stumbled out minutes later looked at her in confusion. She didn't explain. She just fell into line as if nothing had happened. It became her routine. Every morning before dawn, Emily ran alone. Some nights, when exhaustion pressed heavy against her body, she forced herself into extra push-ups and squats until her arms shook. The pain became familiar, almost comforting. Each repetition, each mile, was a quiet rebellion against the humiliation Briggs had tried to stamp on her. And slowly, the others began to notice. One evening after a grueling day of weapons training, Private Hernandez, a broad-shouldered recruit from Texas, leaned against his bunk and watched her drop to the floor for push-ups. "You're insane," he muttered. Emily didn't look up. "Just disciplined." He snorted. "Same thing around here." The next morning, Hernandez joined her on her run. He didn't last half the distance, but when he returned, limping and gasping, he clapped her on the shoulder. "You're tougher than you look, Carter." Word spread. Soon, one or two others started following her into the early morning dark, trying to match her pace. They couldn't, but they kept trying. Colonel Briggs, however, was not blind. He noticed the shift. He saw how Carter no longer sagged at the end of drills, how she carried herself with a steadier stride, how some recruits even looked toward her when they were flagging. It unsettled him. One afternoon, during a marksmanship drill, he barked at her again. "Carter, you think you're some kind of leader now?" "No, sir," she said crisply. "Good, because you're not. You're a recruit, like everyone else. Remember that." "Yes, sir." But Briggs' sharp eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, and the recruits around her exchanged knowing glances. It wasn't just her performance that began to change. It was her attitude. During a rucksack march, when Private Jacobs collapsed on the trail, most recruits groaned at the delay. Emily doubled back, grabbed his arm, and hauled him to his feet. "Come on. You're finishing this." Jacobs cursed under his breath, but her grip was unyielding. She practically dragged him half a mile until he steadied himself again. Later, he muttered, "Why'd you bother?" "Because we don't leave people behind," Emily said simply. It was something her father had drilled into her as a child. And now, out here, it became more than a saying. It was her code. That night, as the recruits gathered in the mess hall, whispers followed Emily again. But they sounded different now. "She runs before dawn every day. She carried Jacob's half the march. Carter's tougher than half of us." The laughter was gone. In its place was curiosity, and maybe even a grudging respect. But the turning point didn't fully arrive until the weekly endurance drill. The recruits were ordered to hold planks for as long as possible. The dirt bit into their elbows, sweat poured down their faces, and muscles trembled. One by one, soldiers collapsed, arms giving out, bodies falling into the mud. Emily held firm. Her arms shook, her stomach burned, her whole body begged her to stop, but she dug deeper. Around her, recruits fell Hernandez, Jacobs, even recruits she thought were stronger than her. Minutes passed like hours. She was one of the last three. Then two. Finally, she was alone, still holding her position. Colonel Briggs watched, arms crossed. He didn't say a word, but his eyes narrowed. When she finally dropped, she didn't collapse in defeat. She rolled to her knees, chest heaving, and saluted. "Sir, completed," she gasped. The other recruits clapped spontaneously, a breach of discipline that shocked even them. But they couldn't help it. For the first time since she arrived, Emily Carter wasn't just enduring training. She was winning it. That night, lying in her bunk, she realized something. Briggs had wanted to humiliate her into breaking. Instead, he had pushed her to a breaking point that had forced her to rebuild herself stronger. And now, the same recruits who once laughed were beginning to see her not as a liability, but as one of them. The turning point had come quietly, without speeches or arguments. Not in defiance, but in discipline. And Emily knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The announcement came on a biting Monday morning, the kind where frost clung stubbornly to the ground, and every breath clouded the air. The recruits stood stiffly in formation, their bodies already aching from a week of endless drills. Colonel Briggs paced in front of him, hands behind his back, his boots clicking with deliberate rhythm. "Recruits," he barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the cold. "Today, you're going to face something that will separate soldiers from civilians. The obstacle course." A ripple went through the line. Even the toughest recruits shifted uneasily. Everyone had heard about it, the mud pits, the climbing walls slick with ice, the low crawl beneath barbed wire, the rope swings that tested every ounce of strength. It wasn't just a test of muscle. It was a test of willpower. Briggs paused dramatically, letting their nerves grow. Then his eyes landed squarely on Emily Carter. "Some of you," he said, voice low but carrying, "won't even make it halfway." The recruits followed his gaze, and whispers rose like smoke. Carter, always Carter. Emily kept her chin up, her jaw set. Inside, her stomach twisted, but she refused to let it show. She could already hear the mocking laughter if she failed, but more than that, she imagined her father's voice urging her on. The course stretched out like a battlefield. Mud pits glistened under the weak morning sun. Thick ropes hung from wooden beams. Walls towered above them, daring them to climb. And the barbed wire, the cruelest part, waited low and sharp over a stretch of gravel and mud. Briggs blew his whistle. "Go!" The recruits exploded forward. Emily sprinted with the pack, her boots pounding the earth. The first challenge was a waist-deep pit of freezing mud. She plunged in without hesitation, the shock seizing her muscles, but she kept moving. Behind her, she heard Hernandez curse as he slipped, nearly going under. Emily grabbed his arm, and hauled him upright before pushing forward again. "Move it, Hernandez," she shouted. He sputtered, but the fire in her voice lit something in him, and he stumbled after her. Next came the climbing wall. 10 feet of rough timber loomed overhead, slick with frost. Recruits leapt and scrambled, some making it over, others sliding back down. Emily dug her fingers into the cracks, muscles screaming as she pulled herself up. Halfway up, she slipped, her boots scraping against the wood. Gasps echoed below. But instead of falling, she dug in harder, teeth gritted. With a final push, she swung her leg over the top and heaved herself across. She didn't stop. She turned back, saw Private Jacobs struggling at the bottom, arms shaking. Without thinking, she reached down. "Take my hand." Jacobs hesitated, but she barked, "Now." He grabbed her wrist, and with a growl of effort, she hauled him up. Both tumbled over the wall, gasping, but alive. Other recruits noticed. Not just that she'd made it, but that she hadn't left someone behind. The rope swings came next. The pit below was deeper, filled with black, sucking mud. The rope was thick and heavy, its fibers rough against her palms. She ran, swung out, and for a split second, her stomach dropped as the rope carried her over the pit. She hit the ground hard on the other side, rolling to her feet. Behind her, a recruit lost grip and splashed into the pit, swallowed by mud. Others groaned, but kept moving. Emily hesitated, wanting to help, but Briggs' voice thundered across the field. "Leave him. Soldiers don't wait for the weak." Emily clenched her jaw. No, that wasn't her way. But this time, she had to choose stay and help, or push forward and prove herself. Her chest ached with the weight of it. She pushed forward, not because she didn't care, but because she knew she'd need strength for what was still ahead. The final stretch was the barbed wire crawl. Recruits dropped to their bellies, crawling through mud and gravel as the sharp wire loomed inches above their backs. The ground cut into Emily's elbows and knees. Mud smeared across her face, but she kept moving. The wire snagged at her uniform, ripping threads. She ignored it. Halfway through, she heard Hernandez's groans beside her. He was slowing, his body refusing to move. Emily hissed through clenched teeth, "Don't stop. Keep going. I can't." "Yes, you can. Look at me. You're not quitting. We finish this together." Her voice was steel, unyielding. Hernandez gritted his teeth and crawled again, fueled by her defiance. When Emily finally rolled out from under the wire, mud-covered and bleeding from shallow cuts, she staggered to her feet. Ahead was the finish line only yards away. She sprinted, every muscle screaming, lungs on fire. She crossed first. The recruits behind her erupted in stunned silence before cheers broke out. Some clapped, some shouted her name. Mud streaked her face, her uniform torn, but she stood tall, chest heaving, eyes unbroken. Briggs' whistle blew, sharp and long. He didn't clap. He didn't cheer. But his face was tight, jaw clenched. The woman he had drenched, humiliated, and targeted had just destroyed his course, and done it while pulling others forward. The recruits gathered around, slapping her back, mud flying in every direction. Hernandez grinned through exhaustion. "You're insane, Carter. But damn, you're a machine." Emily just shook her head, gasping for air. Not insane, just determined. Jacobs, still trembling from the wall climb, muttered, "You didn't have to help me." "Yes, I did," she said simply. And something shifted in that moment. They weren't just looking at her as the girl Briggs tried to break. They were looking at her as a soldier. Later that night, Briggs summoned her to his office. She stood at attention, mud still staining her uniform, her hands clenched at her sides. "You think today proved something?" Briggs demanded. "No, sir," Emily said. "I think today proves nothing. Tomorrow will prove more." For a long moment, Briggs stared at her. His jaw worked, his eyes sharp, but there was no mockery this time. Only a flicker barely visible of respect. "Dismissed," he said finally. Emily saluted sharply and walked out. The recruits watched her pass in the corridor, their whispers following. She finished first. She helped Jacobs and Hernandez. She's the real deal. And for the first time since her arrival, Emily Carter walked into the barracks not as an outsider, but as one of them. The colonel had set a trap meant to humiliate her, but instead, she had turned his challenge into her victory. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew it. Emily Carter had just shocked the entire base. The sun was dipping low, staining the sky with streaks of orange and crimson as the recruits marched back from the obstacle course. Their boots squelched in the mud, their uniforms torn, faces smeared with dirt and exhaustion. Normally, after such a grueling day, silence ruled the barracks. But tonight was different. Whispers filled the air, growing louder with each passing minute. "Did you see her climb that wall? She pulled Jacobs up like he weighed nothing. And she beat everyone. Emily Carter walked among them, her head lowered, trying to ignore the storm of voices. Her muscles screamed, her knees still raw from gravel, and her hands stung from rope burns. But inside, she carried something stronger than pain, the fire of having proven herself. Yet the fire came with unease. Victory brought attention, and attention at a military base was never simple. By the time they reached the mess hall, word of her performance had already spread beyond her unit. Soldiers from other companies craned their necks to get a look at her. Some smirked, some glared, and a few offered nods of respect. Private Collins, who had mocked her since day one, muttered loudly enough for the table to hear. "Guess Carter's got more in her than just luck." His tone dripped sarcasm, but even he couldn't mask the grudging acknowledgement. At another table, Hernandez was recounting the wall climb in animated detail. "She just reached down and yanked Jacobs up like it was nothing. I swear, I thought the colonel would blow a fuse right there." Laughter and cheers followed, the kind of banter that usually circled around war stories. Now it circled around her. Emily sat quietly, forcing herself to eat, though every bite turned heavy in her throat. She hadn't come here for glory. She hadn't come to be the subject of gossip. She came to survive training, to honor her father's memory, and to become a soldier. But she couldn't deny it. She had their attention now. Colonel Briggs noticed too. In his office, the blinds were half drawn as he leaned back in his chair, reviewing the day's reports. His jaw clenched tighter with every line. Carter first to finish. Carter helped others complete the course. Carter displayed initiative and teamwork. He slammed the folder shut. It wasn't just that she succeeded. It was that she had turned his carefully designed humiliation into a rallying point. He had drenched her in front of the recruits to prove her weakness, but now she stood taller in their eyes than he ever intended. "Dangerous," he muttered. He couldn't afford a recruit undermining his authority, especially one who refused to break. The next morning, the whispers turned into open stares. As Emily stood in formation, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some admired, others measured her like competition. When Briggs strode out, silence fell instantly. His gaze swept the line, finally resting on her. "Yesterday was a fluke," he declared. His voice carried like thunder. "One victory does not make a soldier. You will all be tested again, and again, until the weak are burned away." His eyes bore into Emily's, cold and deliberate. She didn't flinch, but deep down she understood. He wasn't finished with her. He would come harder, sharper, determined to expose her. The shock of her performance spread beyond the recruits. In the officers' lounge that evening, conversations buzzed. Briggs has a problem on his hands, one lieutenant remarked over coffee. That girl embarrassed his course. She made him look like he underestimated her. Another officer smirked. Or maybe she's exactly what this place needs. Fresh blood, determination, not the same old swagger. Careful, a third warned. Briggs doesn't like his authority questioned. The room hummed with unspoken tension. For years, Briggs had ruled the base with intimidation. Now, a single recruit mud-streaked, and unyielding was shaking that order. For Emily, the change came subtly but powerfully. That night, as she laced her boots in the barracks, Jacobs approached her quietly. His voice was low, hesitant. "Thanks for helping me." Back at the wall, she looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his eyes. "You'd have done the same?" He shook his head. "No, not everyone would have stopped. But you did." That meant something. Before she could respond, Hernandez plucked down on the bunk beside them, grinning. "She's not just a soldier, she's the one keeping us together." Emily frowned. "Don't put me on a pedestal. I'm just here to survive like the rest of you." But even as she said it, she realized survival wasn't enough anymore. Whether she wanted it or not, the others were starting to see her as something more. The next day's drills were harsher. Briggs ordered longer runs, heavier packs, fewer breaks. Recruits collapsed in the dirt, panting and groaning. Emily pushed through, though her legs trembled and sweat poured down her back. Every time she faltered, she caught sight of another recruit, watching her, waiting to see if she would quit. That expectation drove her forward. During one run, Collins tripped, his ankle twisting beneath him. He cursed, trying to stand, but the pain was obvious. The drill instructors barked for everyone else to keep moving. Emily slowed, torn between orders and instinct. Then she doubled back, slinging Collins' arm over her shoulders. "Carter, what the hell are you doing?" Collins spat, grimacing. "Getting you to the finish," she snapped. "Shut up and move." Together, they staggered forward, her body carrying most of his weight. When they finally crossed the line, Collins collapsed, glaring at her, but too exhausted to argue. The other recruits erupted in murmurs again. Emily had disobeyed the unspoken rule: leave the weak behind. And yet, she had done what no one else dared. That night, Briggs called a private meeting with his senior sergeants. "She's disrupting the balance," he growled, pacing the room. "They're looking to her, not me." "That ends now." One sergeant hesitated. "With respect, sir, maybe she's showing the kind of leadership we want in the next generation. Soldiers who don't abandon each other." Briggs froze, his eyes narrowing. "Leadership? She's a recruit. Nothing more. If they start idolizing her, it undermines the chain of command." The sergeant swallowed hard, nodding. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Back in the barracks, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The day's weight pressed on her. She hadn't asked for admiration. She hadn't asked to lead. And yet, every choice she made, every hand she extended, every burden she carried, was shaping something bigger. The shock wasn't just that she had conquered the obstacle course. It was that, for the first time, the recruits believed in something greater than fear. They believed in her. And whether she liked it or not, she knew this. The colonel would not let it stand. Emily Carter had become more than a soldier in training. She had become a challenge to the system itself. And the base would never be the same. The days after Emily's triumph blurred into a haze of sweat and strain. Each morning began before the sun crept over the horizon, with the sharp crack of the drill instructor's whistle, pulling recruits from thin cots into the biting cold. Every step, every breath, every blister was meant to strip them down and rebuild them into soldiers. But for Emily Carter, it wasn't just training anymore. It was survival under fire. Colonel Briggs had made her his target. The first signs were subtle. Longer runs where her pack mysteriously weighed more than the others. Punishments doled out faster when she was even a second late to formation. And scornful remarks that cut deeper than any blade. "Carter," he sneered one morning, inspecting the recruits' uniforms. "Did you forget how to iron? Or is sloppy just your natural state?" The others shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the deliberate singling out. But Emily stayed stone-faced, her voice steady. "No excuse, sir." She refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking her composure. The breaking point came during the endurance gauntlet, a notorious test whispered about in the barracks. It began at dawn. The recruits lined up on the frozen parade ground, steam rising from their mouths in the frigid air. Briggs stalked before them, his boots crunching against frost. "Today," he barked, "you will learn what it means to be pushed past your limits. You will march, crawl, climb, and bleed until the weak among you quit. And they will quit." His gaze pinned Emily like a nail to wood. "You first, Carter. Lead the pack." The gauntlet was a twisted marathon of suffering. 10 miles of rough terrain with obstacles every step of the way. The recruits sprinted through mud pits, scaled icy walls, dragged sandbags uphill, and carried logs across their shoulders until their spines screamed. By the 5th mile, sweat soaked Emily's uniform despite the cold. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body threatening to fold. But she forced her legs to move, one after another, as though each step was a promise to her father, to herself, to everyone who doubted her. Behind her, Hernandez stumbled, Jacobs groaned, and Collins cursed under his breath. But no matter how hard the course got, they all kept their eyes locked on her back, their silent anchor. Halfway through, Briggs raised the stakes. At the foot of a steep incline covered in loose gravel, he barked orders. "Carter, carry the casualty." 2 instructors dumped a sand-filled stretcher at her feet, heavier than anything she had ever lifted. The recruits stared, stunned. It usually took 2 men to carry. Emily gritted her teeth and heaved it onto her shoulders. Her knees buckled instantly, the weight crushing down on her spine. "Move," Briggs thundered. She staggered forward, every step agony. Gravel shifted under her boots, threatening to send her tumbling backward. Her muscles screamed, her vision blurred, but she kept climbing. "Come on, Carter." Hernandez shouted from behind, breaking formation. "You don't have to. Stay back." Briggs roared. She wanted to prove herself. Let her. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, each one a knife in her chest. Her body begged her to quit, to drop the stretcher and collapse. But quitting wasn't an option. Not anymore. She forced herself upward, inch by inch, until her boots touched the crest. With one last cry, she hurled the stretcher down and collapsed to her knees. The recruits erupted in stunned silence. Even Briggs hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. But instead of acknowledging her feat, he barked, "Back in formation." This isn't a victory lap. The gauntlet continued. Rope climbs tore skin from palms. Crawls through gravel-shredded uniforms and left blood streaked across elbows and knees. Ice-cold water dunks left recruits shivering and gasping for air. By the final obstacle, a wall coated in mud and grease, towering like a fortress, the recruits were broken shells of themselves. Some sobbed quietly. Others lay in the dirt, too spent to rise. Emily stood before the wall, staring up, her chest heaving. Her body was wrecked, her hands bleeding, her legs trembling. She didn't know if she could even lift her arms anymore. Briggs stepped close, his voice low enough only she could hear. "Climb it, Carter, or admit you don't belong here." Her vision blurred, but she set her jaw. She leapt, her fingers scrabbling against the slick surface. Twice she slipped, falling hard onto her knees. The third time, she dug her nails into the wood, pulling herself upward despite the mud dragging her down. Every inch was war. Every pull was pain. Behind her, the recruits started chanting softly. Carter, Carter, Carter. The chant grew louder, stronger, until it shook the field. Carter, Carter, Carter. With one final surge, she swung her leg over the wall and collapsed on the other side. Her chest heaved, tears mixing with mud on her cheeks. The recruits cheered like they had won a war. Briggs' face darkened, thunderclouds in his eyes. He had designed the gauntlet to destroy her, to strip her bare in front of everyone. Instead, she had become their rallying cry. That night, the barracks buzzed with energy. Hernandez clapped her on the back. You carried that damn stretcher like a tank. Briggs must have been fuming. Jacobs nodded solemnly. You made us believe we could finish. Without you, we wouldn't have. Even Collins, who had once mocked her, muttered, Guess you're tougher than I thought. Emily sat on her bunk, exhausted beyond words. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed, but her spirit burned stronger than ever. She had been dragged to the edge of collapse, forced into humiliation, and still she rose. But Briggs wasn't finished. In his office, he stared at the reports with cold fury. Every note about Carter was another nail in his pride. She wasn't breaking. She was thriving. She thinks she's untouchable, he muttered. Tomorrow, she learns otherwise. For him, it wasn't about training anymore. It was personal. For Emily, it was survival. And for the base, the battle lines were being drawn. Because the breaking point hadn't shattered her, it had turned her into a symbol. And nothing was more dangerous to a man like Colonel Briggs than a soldier who refused to break. The morning air was razor-sharp, slicing into the lungs of every recruit standing at attention. The parade ground stretched wide and gray beneath the rising sun, a stage upon which countless soldiers had been forged or shattered. Colonel Briggs stood before them, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes like steel. He looked more severe than usual, his jaw locked tight, his gaze burning holes into the line. Today wasn't another day of drills. Today was something else. Everyone could feel it. Emily Carter stood among the ranks, her body still battered from the gauntlet. Her bruises ached beneath her uniform, her knees stiff with half-healed cuts, but her eyes were clear, steady, alive. She could sense it too. Briggs was building toward something, and whatever it was, it would land squarely on her shoulders. Recruits, Briggs barked, his voice echoing off the concrete. In war, there is no room for weakness. No room for hesitation. You will obey orders without question, because hesitation gets men killed. He paused, pacing like a wolf. Some of you think you've proven something. Some of you think grit and teamwork are enough. His eyes flicked toward Emily. But this is not a game of heroes. It is obedience that wins wars. The recruits stiffened. The air around Emily thickened like fog. She knew he was speaking to her without saying her name. Then came the test. Carter stepped forward. Her boots echoed against the ground as she broke formation and stood at attention before him. His shadow stretched across her, tall and imposing. You like to carry others. To play the savior, Briggs said, circling her like a predator. Today, you will prove you can follow orders. You will obey without question. He snapped his fingers, and 2 drill instructors dragged a wooden crate into the center of the ground. It was filled with water ice cold, frosted at the edges, a cruel reminder of winter's bite. Carter, Briggs said slowly, savoring every word, get in the crate and stay there until I tell you otherwise. Gasps rippled through the recruits. Everyone knew what this meant. Hypothermia, exhaustion, humiliation. Emily's chest tightened. This wasn't training. It was punishment. Designed not to test her body, but to crush her spirit in front of everyone. She met Briggs' eyes. "Sir, with respect, what does this teach?" Briggs' voice cracked like a whip. "It teaches obedience. Now move." Silence fell across the field. Every recruit stared at her, holding their breath. If she refused, it meant insubordination. If she obeyed, it meant submission. Her heart pounded. She thought of her father, the man who had worn his uniform with quiet dignity, who had told her, "A soldier's duty is not blind obedience. It is courage to do what's right." Her fists clenched at her sides. "I will not, sir." The words dropped like thunder. The recruits froze. Even the instructors seemed stunned. No one disobeyed Briggs. Ever. His face darkened, a storm gathering. "What did you say, Recruit Carter?" She stood taller, though fear rattled in her chest. "With respect, sir, I will not climb into that crate. Not because I fear the cold, but because it serves no purpose. It does not make me a better soldier. It does not make this unit stronger. It only humiliates one for the amusement of another." The silence was deafening. Some recruits looked horrified, certain she'd just ended her military career. Others, Jacobs, Hernandez, even Collins, watched with wide eyes, their chests swelling with something dangerously close to pride. Briggs' jaw clenched so hard the muscle in his cheek twitched. His voice dropped to a deadly low. "You think you know better than your commanding officer?" Emily didn't waver. "I think a soldier must know the difference between strength and cruelty." The explosion came. "You are out of line." Briggs roared, his voice shaking the ground. "Do you think you can stand here and lecture me? You are nothing. You are a recruit, and I can have you discharged before sundown." The threat hung in the air. Everyone believed it. Briggs had ended careers before they even began. But Emily held his gaze. "If that is what it takes, sir, then so be it. At least I will have stood for something." For a moment, even Briggs seemed taken aback. No one had ever spoken to him like that. The recruits began to murmur. Soft at first, then louder. "She's right. That's not training. That's abuse. She's braver than all of us." The murmur grew into a wave. Dozens of voices rising together, no longer afraid. For weeks, Briggs had ruled with fear. Now that fear was cracking. Hernandez finally shouted, "If she's punished for refusing, then punish me too." Jacob stepped forward. "Me too." One by one, recruits left formation, standing beside Emily, their chins high. Even Collins, who had mocked her endlessly, moved forward with a scowl. "Damn it, she's right. Enough is enough." The line fractured, splitting into obedience to Briggs or solidarity with Emily. Briggs' face turned crimson. His voice thundered. "Back in line, all of you, or you will regret this day." But the recruits did not move. Their unity was louder than his rage. Emily's heart hammered, but she forced her voice steady. "Sir, you can try to break one of us, but you cannot break all of us. We are not here to be humiliated. We are here to become soldiers." The words carried across the field, as clear and sharp as a bell. For a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. From the corner of the grounds, a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Colonel." Everyone turned. A figure approached Captain Reeves, one of the senior officers on base. He had been watching quietly from the sidelines, his expression unreadable until now. Briggs stiffened. "Captain, this is my command." "Your command has become a circus," Reeves interrupted coldly. "I've seen enough. These recruits respect her because she shows them what real leadership looks like. Perhaps you should ask yourself why they do not show the same respect to you." The words hit Briggs harder than any bullet. His face twisted with fury, but he could not openly defy his superior. Emily stood, chest heaving, eyes locked with Briggs. She had disobeyed, spoken out, and rallied others without intending to. She hadn't just survived his torment, she had turned it into her stand. For the first time, Briggs looked not like an unshookable commander, but a man losing control. "Fall back in line," Reeves ordered the recruits. Slowly, they obeyed, but their eyes never left Emily. She had become something more than one of them. She had become their voice. That night, the barracks buzzed like a storm. Hernandez grinned. "You stood up to Briggs and lived. That's insane." Jacobs nodded solemnly. "You didn't just stand for yourself. You stood for all of us." Even Collins muttered, "Guess you've got more guts than anyone here." Emily sat on her bunk, her hands trembling from the weight of it all. She hadn't meant to lead a rebellion. She had only followed her conscience. But sometimes, conscience was contagious. She stared at the ceiling, hearing her father's words again. Courage isn't just facing the enemy. Sometimes it's facing your own commander. And tonight, she had done exactly that. Colonel Briggs, however, sat alone in his office, the darkness heavy around him. His pride was wounded, his authority shaken. Emily Carter had defied him, and the base had witnessed it. His hand tightened into a fist. This wasn't over. But deep inside, for the first time, he wondered if she was the kind of soldier the army needed, and if he had just created his own replacement. The barracks were alive with whispers the next morning. Recruits shuffled into their uniforms, their conversations hushed but electric, like sparks skittering across dry kindling. Emily Carter had not only survived Colonel Briggs' wrath, she had defied him publicly. It was the kind of story recruits normally passed in secret, like contraband. But this time, it wasn't whispered in fear. It was spoken with pride. She stood up to him, right in front of everyone, and didn't flinch. Reeves himself backed her up. By breakfast, Emily was no longer just another recruit. She was a symbol. But Emily herself didn't feel like one. Sitting at the far end of the mess hall, her tray untouched, she wrestled with unease. The adrenaline from yesterday's confrontation had worn off, leaving behind a gnawing weight. She hadn't wanted to lead a rebellion. She hadn't wanted to humiliate Briggs. She had only wanted to protect the dignity of herself and her fellow recruits. Now, she was at the center of something far bigger than herself. And the colonel wasn't the kind of man to forget humiliation. Her thoughts were interrupted when Jacobs dropped into the seat across from her, grinning. "You've officially gone down in base history," he said, stabbing at his eggs. "Half the recruits are already calling you Ironheart Carter," Emily groaned. "Please don't." "Too late," Hernandez chimed in, sliding onto the bench. "It's spreading like wildfire. Even Collins was bragging last night that he stood with you, like he wasn't shaking in his boots." Emily managed a small laugh. But deep down, she knew titles and nicknames were dangerous. They created expectations. Expectations created targets. And right now, she was a target painted bright red. A summons came later that day. "Recruit Carter," a drill instructor barked. "Report to Colonel Briggs' office, now." The mess hall went silent. Every head turned as Emily rose from her seat, her stomach twisting into knots. She marched out without a word, her boots echoing on the pavement like drumbeats of fate. Briggs' office was dim, blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. The colonel sat behind his desk, motionless except for the tapping of one finger against the wood. His eyes were colder than steel when they lifted to meet hers. "Sit," Emily obeyed. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "You embarrassed me yesterday," Briggs said finally, his voice low but seething. "You questioned my authority in front of the entire base. Emily met his gaze steadily. "I stood for what I believed was right, sir." His eyes narrowed. "Do you think this army runs on what every recruit believes is right? Do you think war waits for your conscience?" "No, sir," Emily said quietly. "But I think soldiers fight better when they believe in what they're fighting for. When they know their leaders value them, not just their obedience." Briggs leaned forward, his face shadowed. "You think you're ready to lead, Carter? Leadership isn't speeches and defiance. It's responsibility. It's carrying the weight when men die because of your decisions. Do you think you're ready for that?" Emily swallowed hard. "I don't know if anyone is ever ready. But I do know this. Breaking people doesn't make them stronger. Building them does." For a long moment, Briggs just stared at her, searching her face for weakness. But there was none. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You're lucky Captain Reeves interfered. If it had been just me, you'd already be on a bus home." Emily didn't flinch. "Then maybe I am lucky, sir." The meeting ended without punishment, without dismissal, but also without resolution. Emily walked out with her heart pounding. She hadn't been crushed. Not yet. But Briggs' eyes had promised one thing. This was far from over. In the weeks that followed, training intensified. But something had changed. The recruits carried themselves differently. Shoulders squared, voices louder, movements sharper. They no longer marched in fear. They marched with pride. And when the exhaustion hit, when the drills pushed them to collapse, Emily noticed something remarkable. They looked to her. Not consciously, perhaps, but in the way soldiers glance at their anchor. She became the unspoken point of reference, the one they measured their grit against. If Carter kept going, so would they. She had become the quiet heart of the unit. Colonel Briggs noticed too. Instead of singling her out, he began testing her in new ways. Leadership drills, tactical decisions, situations where a single wrong call would let her team down. And Emily rose to every challenge. Not perfectly, she stumbled, doubted, sometimes second-guessed. But every mistake became a lesson. Every setback hardened her resolve. The recruits rallied around her, stronger than ever. Even Collins, once her loudest critic, began deferring to her without realizing it. Briggs pushed, pressured, even tried to corner her, but she didn't break. And slowly, something in Briggs' eyes shifted. Not softness, never that. But perhaps recognition. Graduation day arrived at last. The recruits stood in formation, uniforms crisp, boots gleaming, eyes bright. Families watched from the stands, the air thick with pride and anticipation. Colonel Briggs stood at the podium, his face a mask of severity as he addressed them. "You came here as civilians," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "You leave here as soldiers. You have been tested, pushed, and reshaped by fire. Some of you bent. Some of you nearly broke. But all of you endured." His eyes swept the line, landing briefly inevitably on Emily Carter. "There are many kinds of strength," he continued. "The strength to obey, the strength to endure, and sometimes the strength to stand when standing seems impossible." The words were subtle, but the glance he gave Emily was not. When the ceremony ended, the recruits tossed their caps, shouting in triumph. Families rushed the field, tears and laughter mixing in the summer air. Emily stood with Jacobs, Hernandez, and even Collins, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. They were no longer strangers thrown into the grinder. They were family, bonded by fire. "You did it, Ironheart," Jacobs grinned. Emily laughed, shaking her head. "We did it." Later, as the crowd thinned, Colonel Briggs approached. The recruits stiffened, but he raised a hand. At ease. He stopped in front of Emily, studying her with those unyielding eyes. Then, in a voice barely above a growl, he said. "You're going to make one hell of a soldier, Carter." Maybe more than that. For a man like Briggs, it was more than praise. It was admission. Emily stood taller, saluting sharply. "Thank you, sir." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily lingered on the field, watching shadows stretch across the ground where she had once stood humiliated, drenched with a bucket of water, unsure if she belonged. Now she knew. Her father's words echoed in her heart. Courage isn't just facing the enemy. Sometimes it's facing your own commander. She had done that. She had proven herself not only to the base, but to herself. Emily Carter was no longer just a recruit. She was a soldier. And though her journey was only beginning, one thing was certain: her legacy had already taken root. And the Army would never forget the day she stood against Colonel Briggs.